This story is called Today for Dinner. Today for dinner, I ate a pizza that had fallen on the ground. Technically, it was a flatbread from Slowpokes. And if I'm being totally honest, I ate half on the way home because I was too hungry to wait, and it smelled amazing. But the other half fell full faceplant into the parking lot as I struggled out of my car. Incidentally, this struggle also led to the demise of a library book. Who knew that my empty coffee cup had enough coffee in it to drench a middle-grade graphic novel? If only I had waited until I got home. The pizza box would have remained securely closed. The pizza would have remained dirt-free, and the library book would have remained undrenched. The bitter knowledge that all of this could have been avoided with a little more care and attention turned quickly to resignation. Of course. I scanned the area to make sure no one was watching, then matter-of-factly flipped the remainder of my flatbread back into its box. It has been a week. I have reached the breaking point at my job. So I stayed up late the past several nights, applying for one that looks amazing, but that I'm not altogether qualified for. Good old Harvey is still wreaking havoc and has led to some bonus co-workers, one of whom seems to be doing her damnedest to drive me absolutely nuts. My best Houston friend moved out of state recently, and I have been questioning my decision to remain in this city when the friends I cherish most live elsewhere. And then there's Felix. Felix has many of the qualities I look for in a partner. He's smart, funny, thoughtful, interesting, and tall. Very tall. He makes me feel like I'm the only person who matters. He makes me feel that way, but that way does not reflect our reality. You see, Phoenix has a long-term partner with whom he shares a house and pets and all the trappings of domestic bliss. How did you entangle yourself with a guy who has domestic bliss, you may be asking? Well, it's easier than you think. We were chatting on OkCupid because apparently I am incapable of meeting dateable humans in real life. It was going well, and Felix asked if I wanted to get drinks. I thought that sounded peachy. By the way, he said, I'm poly. I don't have it on my profile for reasons, and you should know before we meet. Now, I have zero experience with the poly community, and I am personally a monogamous kind of gal, but I'm all for expanding my worldview. And we did really click, so I thought we'd get drinks and become friends or something. Well, what actually happened was we had amazing chemistry, and we talked for hours, and he said, "Can we call this a date? Because I'd really like to tear your clothes off." Oh, how could I resist? We kissed in a way that was totally inappropriate for the patio at Addison's. Then went back to my place. It was so good for 3 months. Want to hear something swoony? On our second date, I was telling him about someone who I think is a nincompoop. He stopped me saying, "Oh, I need to pause here so I can kiss the mouth that said nincompoop." We romped around town, spent nearly all of a Mixers and Elixirs examining and discussing the exhibit halls, laughed through Mystery Science Theater 3000, shared a pair of Eclipse glasses, and had very athletic sex. He would casually bring up the idea of meeting his partner. I would casually shut it down. He would say things like, "I missed you," and I would awkwardly deflect. I thought I had made it clear that I needed this arrangement to be casual. But what good are words when you start to catch feelings? Then the hurricane happened, and he was with his partner, and I was alone in my apartment trying to keep myself sane as the water rose. We checked in, and he said, "I care about you." But every time I ran that through my brain, it kept returning the same question. "Then why aren't you here?" I said I cared about him too, realizing for the first time that I actually did. Now it's been a month, and we've barely spoken as we try to navigate our new world. Do I want to stop seeing him? No. Do I foresee my possessive little heart being squished to a bloody pulp if I continue seeing him? Yes. Should I try for one last hurrah? I mean, the sex is pretty great, but wouldn't it be easier to cut it off now while things are stale? How long would I have let this go on if Harvey hadn't presented such a harsh reality check? Should I keep seeing him until I find someone else? Will I ever find someone else? These are the soul-searching deliberations that have turned me into the kind of person who procrastinates making important decisions by writing about them. The kind of person who allows inner turmoil to take over. The kind of person who eats fake pizza off the ground on a Friday night. In case you were wondering, I did microwave it. Yeah. I think that means all the bad stuff is dead.
I'm stuck in this house. It's not completely unpleasant. It's just really hard to leave. The door has a really strong spring holding it shut, and I have to use all my energy to pry it open. I assume things could be worse. When I look out the windows, I can see the trees, the street, the sky, the road. I can see signs on the road, but I can't read them. Some of them are fairly obvious. I can recognize a stop sign or a lost dog post on a lamp outside, but as for some of the others, I have to speculate what they mean. There's a radio system throughout the house. It never turns off. Sometimes it plays music. Sometimes it's just someone screaming. Sometimes it poses strange hypothetical questions. These questions must be answered. I don't have much of a choice. Sometimes it takes days to answer them because it's hard to concentrate over the noise. Sometimes people come to visit. Sometimes they call. Sometimes they leave a message. When people do visit, I can at least see them through the windows. Sometimes I can make out what they're saying. Sometimes, if the noise is low enough, I can actually hear them. When I look out at my neighbors' houses, I can watch them interact with each other. I see them come and go. Sometimes they have barbecues and the whole neighborhood shows up. I wish I could go. Most of the time, my neighbors aren't home. I wonder how they go out so frequently. Their houses must not be very interesting. On occasion, I can get the door open enough to leave the house, but I never stay out long enough because I start feeling tired from the energy it took to open the door. I remember talking to somebody about it, but she was confused as to why I got so tired. It should have been very easy to open the door. She suggested that it was my own fault, that I shouldn't have installed the spring. I'm not the one who installed the spring. I remember once my parents put me in this sort of bubble suit to take me out into the world. It was okay for a time, but it always got foggy and everything sounded muffled. I missed the comfort of the radio. It was too loud at times, but the bubble silence always made me feel uncomfortable. This is not a work of fiction. This is my life. This is how it feels to interact with the world. Unfortunately, most people don't get it. For starters, I wrote this entire story in my head at a bar where I was supposed to be having fun. My girlfriend thought I was having a miserable time. I wasn't. It's just nearly impossible for me to buddy old pal with anyone I don't know. I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable and I'm upset. That 5 years ago, somebody slighted me, and somehow I'm still thinking about it. Prescription drugs are not an option. They never did anything but put me in an emotional coma. I felt like feeling something would have been better than feeling nothing, even if that something is pain. Some people view this kind of diatribe on mental illness as something to worry about. However, contrary to popular belief, mental illness doesn't always mean suicidal depression. I don't feel suicidal. I don't always feel depressed. What I'm trying to communicate is that I am desperately combating my own mind so that I can focus on what you're saying. I am desperately trying to be a part of this world so that I don't even feel slightly connected to. I want so badly to be able to relate because I don't feel like I belong here. I feel like others know it too. I've accepted these things. I accept that every day I will have to fight my own head and overcome because not everyone has secret evil motives. My life is not a movie that I can watch from the outside. I don't want to be treated any differently. I just want people to understand where I'm coming from because I'm desperately trying to be wherever here is. I'm trying to focus on the present. What I'm trying to communicate is that mental illness isn't always something you can see. This is not a cry for help. This is a premeditated apology. I'm sorry if I don't seem like I'm interested. I'm sorry if I don't seem available. I'm sorry if I couldn't hear you. I can't get the door open and the radio is too loud. Thank you.
I've always had an advanced vocabulary. That's not me aggrandizing, that's just candor. I was always the teacher's pet, not only because I've had an advanced lexicon, but also because I listened to the teachers and did my work, which apparently aren't normal characteristics of middle schoolers. While most of my teachers liked me, the feelings weren't always reciprocated. Luckily, I'm great at pretending to not despise people when I need to. So problems usually don't arise, except in 6th grade English class with Mrs. Hoffman. You see, as a 6th grader, I was fully aware that my speech was unusual. Advanced may be a more diplomatic term. I was aware that most kids my age didn't know the words I knew. That was fine. An English teacher not knowing them? I think they should. But what takes an unlettered teacher from being inconvenient to inexcusable is their condescension. Mrs. Hoffman was the southern version of a northeastern socialite. The first book we read was with her was Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, which is one of my favorite books, actually. Growing up reading Agatha Christie is probably one of the reasons I'm so paranoid, but that's neither here nor there. Our first assignment with the book was to read chapter 1 and circle the words we didn't know. Being the good student that I was, I did exactly as I was told. In class, we were listing the words we didn't recognize, and Mrs. Hoffman was writing them on the board. How about you, Addison? What words did you circle? You're quieter than usual today. She sachets over to my desk, and before I can respond, she's yanked the book out of my hand and is flipping through it. Why on earth didn't you do the assignment? I'm sorry, Mrs. Hoffman. I didn't find any words that I don't know. She turns on the heel of her stiletto and marches back to the board. That's when things got strained. She points to the first word on the board and glares expectantly. Addison, would you care to define these? Yes, Miss Hoffman. An abode is a place of residence, like a house. Illegible? Like your class structure, I thought but didn't say. Not clear enough to read. Communion. an exchange of intimate thoughts and feelings unless used in a religious context, then it refers to a specific action in the church. Bask. To lie and enjoy warmth, usually of the sun. Correspondent. A person who writes letters. For Mrs. Hoffman, that was probably the devil himself. This continued for the rest of the class period. I usually try to give people a chance. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe a lot of students made that claim to avoid doing homework. I don't know. But by the time the bell rang, vengeance had been vowed. Being a goody two-shoes, books are my only friend's child that I was, vengeance didn't mean taking action. Vengeance meant being myself. Unfiltered, atypical words and all. Specifically, words Mrs. Hoffman didn't know. The first word I slipped into class discussion was milieu, while talking about the social dynamic on the island in And Then There Were None. Mrs. Hoffman was taken aback, but otherwise didn't react. I used the word plethora next, but she was able to figure that one out from context. This went on for weeks. It was the word cognizant that finally got her. I don't remember what we were discussing. We were down to 3 little golden soldier boys walking in a zoo. I don't really remember my sentence either, but I do remember Mrs. Hoffman's reaction. Her face changed colors like a time-lapse sunset. The first color was a shade of pink, only found in a Chanel perfume commercial. Then her face brightened to that shade of red that socialites always wear to the Met Gala. In true Mrs. Hoffman style, her flushed face matched her shoes. Maybe she knew this moment was coming. I've had quite enough of this, Miss Addison. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hoffman. What's wrong? You know exactly what you're doing, and I'm sick of it. I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Hoffman. You'll have to elucidate. Stop using words that you don't know to make yourself feel superior. In retrospect, I'd like to offer kudos to Mrs. Hoffman for using a polysyllabic word. Mrs. Hoffman, I don't use words I don't know. I do know them. If I don't know them, then you don't know them. Yes, Mrs. Hoffman. I apologize if I was perceived as ill-mannered. I am only attempting to proliferate the inventory of my vernacular. The beauty of this feud was that she couldn't send me to the principal. First off, she didn't know what I was saying, so she couldn't exactly report it. And second of all, an English teacher getting a kid in trouble because they were using big words isn't an ideal situation. So, you might prefer $5 words or 50-cent words, but outsmarting the 6th grade English teacher was definitely priceless. Hey, just because I like big words doesn't mean I'm above wordplay. Thank you.
I was staring off and holding my breath while the spinach hit my face, wondering when this non-stop flight to Newark would just end. Folks, I'm the type of person who actually enjoys talking to their neighbor on the plane. I do not put my headphones on immediately. I do make eye contact rather quickly, and I relish in getting the full scoop on a person whom I will never have to interact with again. But this one fateful flight, I came to learn the caution that most fellow passengers bear when choosing their seat. I was the last group to board a Southwestern flight. And by that time, it was A, take your chances and go deep into the bowels of the airplane looking for the jackpot between two tiny ladies. Or B, hedge your risk early and take one of the first few seats you see. It's a value judgment, right? Because the longer you wait, the more you risk taking by the more risk you're taking by being left with the rejected seat of those before you. So this one time, I took the first seat I saw, but not because I was thinking about value judgments. No. This very slight woman of maybe 90 pounds of mass asked me to sit by her. She simply asked me. That's all she did. And I said yes. Folks, if a stranger asks you to sit by them, run. Sitting by this woman was the beginning of a 4-hour death spiral. Instead of gambling for the future jackpot middle seat, I chose to sit up front by a shriveled up Polish lady with a missing front tooth. Look, guys, I'm not a bad person by pointing out her tooth, and I'll get to the Polish later. It's an important detail. She began the night by introducing herself as Polish and a Catholic, and transitioned into lecturing me on being a good Catholic woman who waits before marriage. She lamented her ex-husband's failings, how her kids wouldn't talk to her, and how they didn't invite her to their weddings. She went into great detail about being Polish, but not because she was from Poland, because it was something clearly she needed to have. To be honest, I had never met a self-professed Polish anyone before that day. And to this day, I'm not sure why I remember her as being so quintessentially Polish. More than being Polish, though, I felt the years of resentment and regret kicked into her thick New Jersey accent. I guess something about her had this old world era to it, like a dog-eared page, like sad, befallen character out of an otherwise jovial Roger and Hammerstein movie. Someone who had values, someone who had been left behind, and someone who just had to be Polish from Jersey. I can't explain it. But she was Polish, told me so, and that was that. In my little pea brain, I took her to be what she said to be. My mouth slightly agape, my eyes wide, I sat hunched over trying to hear, and I listened. So on she went, just like Ringling Circus of sadness, judgment, and dejection, with one creepy clown in the center, and that was her missing tooth. By then, I used to share unpackaged food with people because I had not yet been clobbered by the bitterness of life. Oh, how I would learn. Halfway through the flight, I reached into my bag for a snack that proved to be paramount to the later lesson I would learn. Back then, I was really into raw diet, so I carried around bags of spinach to snack on. In hope that offering food would slow her down, I offered her some spinach. Most normal people would not take a handful of spinach from a stranger on a plane. This woman was not normal, and thus took a handful of spinach from a stranger on a plane into her mouth out of my Ziploc, and much to my dismay spoke at just the same speed as before. Only through operation of chewing causing slimy spinach to spittle out of her mouth and onto my face, through the canal of her front tooth. Folks, did I not warn you about the tooth? At this point, not only were slimy green bits vaulting from her mouth, but a humid cloud of bad breath enveloped us and over the soundtrack of her endless moralizing. I held my breath and smiled as best as I could, but after hours of hearing those moral deliberations, I resigned myself to being the dartboard that I had become. For all that was barreling out of her toothless existence, and accepted the experience as the cost for all the future luck that had previously befallen me on the airplane ridership front. The missing front tooth, out of all the 32 that could have been absent from her mouth, came to symbolize the one-off event I would pay to the belief that most people are still great potential candidates for deep airplane conversation. To this day, I still believe in waiting a minute to put my headphones in. I still believe in making eye contact early. I'm still open to discovering fast friends on the way to Newark, New Orleans, or San Francisco. But I will never forget the fateful front tooth when boarding a Southwest flight. Thank you.
One, two. Hello, everyone. Money, Lawns, and Death by John Wayne, Comunale. I dedicate this performance to my friend Jeff Hunter. I'm getting it. Okay, here we go. I have always had a good work ethic. And for the most part, I can credit my dad in the example he set for me growing up. I don't think he was trying to teach me anything on purpose, though. He had to work so hard, and his mind was too occupied to pause for a potential teachable moment. But the lesson was learned. I was far from spoiled as a child, and if I wanted something, I had to earn my own money to buy it. My brother and sister and I were assigned chores to complete every weekend, for which we were compensated in the form of a small allowance. Being the oldest, the lion's share of chores were of course heaped upon me, including the biggest and most time-consuming task coming in the form of yard work. I hated this job with all my being, but there was no getting out of it, and there was certainly no complaining in our house. My weekend couldn't officially begin until the yard work was done, and there were many Fridays I rushed home from school to complete the task that evening, so to be able to enjoy a full freedom of an entire Saturday. I was also the kid that did all his homework on Friday night, so I wouldn't have to worry about it. For a while, my allowance was enough to satisfy my humble needs until I turned 14, and a pair of shoes became the object of my obsession. Everyone at my school had Nikes. Everyone. Everyone except for me, of course, whose parents were still buying shoes exclusively from Payless. I knew the drill, but asked my parents anyway, getting the answer I expected. I would have to save my allowance and buy them on my own. But at that rate, I'd graduate high school before I had enough money. My dad always gave me sound advice on the matters such as these, so I asked him what he thought I should do to earn more money. To which he replied, "Get a job." This was logical, of course, but the job market for unskilled 14-year-olds was pretty barren at the time. The next day, my dad came into the house with a solution to this problem. He told me he talked to the neighbor across the street, whose name was Chris. And Chris told my dad how his son was going into the Marines in a week. Among the detractors of his son moving out was that he and his wife would have to find someone to take care of their lawn. They were both in their late 50s and terribly obese, which was why they probably just didn't take on the job for themselves. This was the first time my dad sold me into indentured servitude. He told Chris that I was looking for a way to earn some extra cash for some shoes, and he should have me do it for $10 a week. Now, I was not present during these negotiations. Or otherwise, I would have haggled on the pay, but at the time, I was generally satisfied. I was pretty sure my dad already told Chris I would do it without asking me, but I jumped at the offer nonetheless, developing temporary amnesia for my hatred of all yard work. The memories came quickly rushing back in a bad way when I started up the mower in Chris's yard that Saturday. I hated yard work more than anything in the world. Now, instead of losing some of this precious Saturday to mowing one lawn, I would lose even more having to mow two. The thought was demoralizing enough. Actually doing it was 10 times worse. Chris's yard was smaller than ours, but the grass in his backyard was thicker and overrun with weeds. Also, Chris and his wife owned 2 chows that shit so much you would think they were herding cattle back there. Trust me, running over many piles of shit with a self-mulching mower doesn't end up good for anyone involved. This, and Chris's constant pointing out that I missed a spot, made the job significantly longer than it should have been. When I was done, I would trudge back across the street with bleeding calluses and specks of shit covering my legs from the mid-thigh down. I hated every second of mowing that lawn. I was constantly a pussy hair away from quitting. But, despite the pussy hair, the desire for my coveted Nikes spurred me on. The going was a lot slower than I anticipated. Even with the weekly $10 bump, I was still ways off from the money I'd need. I kept telling myself it was worth it, but along with the difficulty of the job, the way Chris interacted with me was slowly poisoning the well. He was never in a good mood. He would speak to me in that curt, condescending way one only talked to someone they had over a barrel. I think he had resentment issues between he and his son and were projecting them onto me, or he was a giant asshole. Either way, I took the abuse, keeping my head down and my eyes on the prize. After a few weeks, a friend of mine at school told me he and his brother had also started mowing lawns on their street for $10. The difference being they were doing the work together and each being paid $10. Not 10 to split between them, but 10 a piece. I would not know what spiraling out meant until much later in life, but this was the first time I experienced it. I could think of nothing the rest of the day except how I was being hosed by my prick of a neighbor, and what was I going to do about it? When I finally got home from school that day, I unburdened my frustrations upon my dad, asked what he thought I should do. He imparted on me the wisdom of a man who had worked hard his whole life and said, if I wanted a raise, I should just ask for it. That was that. Just knock on the door. Look right into the hate-filled glare of a man whose clearly misdirected anger he felt over his life issues at me, anyone else he happened to be around, and ask him for a raise? A few days later, I finished mowing Chris's lawn and did just that. I knocked on the door to collect my pay and launched into my spiel I had been practicing in my head all morning. I told him I felt I'd been working hard, and the job took longer than usual since I had to deal with all the weeds and all the dog shit, and how my friends were also mowing lawns too, but getting paid more than me. For these reasons, I told him I felt I deserved an extra $5 a week. I didn't want to be greedy. Asked for 10, plus I thought he'd be more comfortable moving up in $5 increments. Chris's eyes narrowed, his lips puckered like a lemon-flavored lesion had all of a sudden burst in his mouth. My wife and I will discuss it and let you know, he said in an aggravated tone and shut the door. I went home feeling hopeful, since I hadn't been giving a definite no right away, so I felt there was at least a chance. I waited all week expecting a phone call from Chris, or waited for him to come by and deliver his decision to me, but there was no communication from him. On Saturday, I went across the street to perform my duties as usual, but was racked with nervous anxiety waiting for his answer. When I finished, I knocked on the door to collect my pay and my answer. Chris opened up, stood in the doorway, his massive body eclipsing my view into the house behind him. There was a beat of silence as we stared at each other, and then I finally spoke. Hi, Chris. Did you get to... Yes, we discussed the raise, he said, cutting me off. The truth is, I don't think you do good enough job to be paid the $10 we already do, let alone $5 more. The answer's no. With that, he reached out and stuffed a greasy, wadded up $10 bill into my hand and shut the door. I held my tears in until I made it to my house, where I exploded in a fit of crying rage. My parents came to see what was wrong, and through hyperventilated sobs, I told them what happened. I was too upset to give my parents a chance to console me, and I shouted over and over again that I quit, and I hated Chris. I hope he died. I hope he died. I'd used up all the confrontational energy in my 14-year-old body. I proclaimed to my dad that since he got me the job, he was telling Chris I quit, because I never wanted to see or talk to him again. I hope he died. There, they were finally able to calm me down, trying to tell me what a valuable lesson I learned and all that bullshit. But at that point, I didn't care. The next day, my dad went over to Chris's house and told them I wasn't going to mow their stupid lawn anymore. I'm sure they did the things adults do when they talk about kids, saying things like, well, he'll learn one day, and I thought it'd toughen him up, or other similarly dismissive remarks. I held my ground as far as never talking to him again, or even looking in his direction if he was outside. I went back to being happy with my paltry allowance, and although it took a while, I was able to buy the shoes I so badly thought I had needed. A few years went by, and I never changed how I felt about my neighbor Chris. I eventually moved out. My freshman year of college, I didn't think about him at all for a long time, until my sister called me one morning. She told me the night before, the police and ambulances showed up across the street at Chris's house. She watched from her window as they wheeled a body out on a gurney covered in a sheet. And they came down the driveway. She said an arm fell out from under the sheet and dangled lifelessly, like something you'd see in a movie. She told me Chris had a heart attack, and Chris had died. I hung up the phone, thinking about how I held such a grudge against this man for years, spraying mental hate rays at him silently from across the street. I mean, this guy was clearly unhappy in his life, which I had nothing to do with, but he took it out on me when he could without giving it a second thought. And I thought about how for so long I wished he was dead. And now he was dead. And all I could think was, fuck that guy. I'm a hard worker, okay? And because of my parents, they set the example for me. That's for sure. But I never wanted anyone to say to me what Chris did that day, which is another form of motivation in itself. Since becoming an adult, owning my own house, I kept good on a promise I had made myself all those years ago. I haven't mowed a lawn since I moved out of my parents' house, and so help me God, I never will.
Give it up from one host to another. Amazing job. I'm so glad that that dude with the name walked up here one day so he could be our host tonight. He's my friend. I'm allowed to say that about him. Okay. This story is going to have a much different reception than the last story, if you didn't catch that by the title, Darrels Funeral. So, spoiler alert. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate and remember Darrell Isaacs, who was taken from us too soon. It's really that easy. That's what it should have been. A celebration of better times. His passions, his loves, his soul, with some salve thrown in for the living, for we could not save him from drowning in his own woes. Here is what I would like to tell you about my friend. I went to Deer Park High School with Darrell. We were both in band. He loved listening to and playing music. He played the saxophone and took it as seriously as an unserious teenager can. He was smart and quick-witted. He had a curly mullet and giant glasses, but I still thought he was cute. It seemed like everyone liked him. He was wickedly funny, and unlike other boys, kind to me. We both loved Letterman. You could see that he cared for his friends. He liked to moon people while traveling in cars. I expanded my musical taste because of him, leading me down this whole other path than the one I would have been traveling as a 14-year-old baby who loved Wilson Phillips. I like how somebody just goes, "Oh, I'm sorry you liked Wilson Phillips." I could tell that he was sensitive. I could tell that he was hurting sometimes. This is where my first-hand memories of Darrell end, and those are now more than 25 years old. Other friends continue his timeline with memories of working with him in record stores and going to college with him. He was apparently a prolific mixtape maker. By all accounts, he was still funny, lively, wild, maybe getting a little lost, as we all did after high school. What next? What now? Everything is hard. Who do I love? How do I stop when there's no one here to stop me? Then it gets murky for a lot of us. We finished college, partnered up, married off, moved on, got serious. He simply didn't join us. And I don't know where he went. He friended me on Facebook in 2011, 20 years after we first met. He sent me a message not long after that that said he thought we were a lot alike because we were both sensitive. I could tell that he was lonely, that Facebook was a window back to his younger, happier life. I had spent 20 years collecting other sensitive people in the world, and he seemed surprised to have found a new one. If I asked him to meet me for coffee, he would have said no. He lived with his mother in Baytown. He didn't have a car. He only sometimes had a job. He seemed depressed and embarrassed, which kept him away from people. Whatever happened in those missing years couldn't have been good. He looked gaunt in photos. He complained of a litany of health concerns, not to mention his mother's many problems that he had to nurse. I'm not sure how they got by. Because I was outspoken about my mental health issues on Facebook, he asked me for help once. I tried to find it for him. He said he needed therapy and that previous attempts at getting help felt like being in prison. It didn't dawn on me right away that he was talking about fighting addiction. In Texas, you're treated like a criminal when seeking that kind of help with no money.
He would message me from time to time about music and comedians. Sometimes the messages bordered on needy and I wouldn't know how to respond. He was in and out of the hospital. He was in jail at some point. His pictures got more gaunt, more pale. I started to meet back up with others who knew him, and we would ask each other about him. We would all shrug. He would fall away for months, then appear in someone's life, a little more of a ghost every time. In April, a friend received a call from him, but she was driving, so she let it go to voicemail. He was slurring in the recording. She didn't want to call back. Around this time, he sent me and a group of others a message asking for our phone numbers and mailing addresses. I didn't respond. I thought it was a strange request. I saw others drop out of the message thread without responding. It's haunted me. I received word not long after that he was found dead in his bed on May 4th at the age of 42. Friends and a few relatives gathered for memorial service on a Sunday evening late in May. His old friends didn't really want to drive to a church off the freeway in Baytown, but we went for Darrel's family, imagining they needed our help or that we could comfort them. We found ourselves in a muted, tacky structure called Church on the Rock, the kind of church with fluorescent lighting and event chairs instead of pews. A smiling picture of Darrel, perhaps from high school graduation, was placed at the front of the stage. I'm an atheist, and I'm fairly certain Darrel was too. The church service was clearly the wish of his aunt and mother, just the thing you would do when someone dies. But it wasn't the kind of gathering that Darrel would have wanted. He would have wanted everyone to rage, listen to good songs, drink too much, and laugh. I'm not sure how much he would have cared about the opinions of family members who never understood him. We quietly waited for something to start, tense in our chairs, wondering about the other people we hadn't seen in decades, how weird we all looked now, stretched and swollen. The pastor, shabbily dressed in an ill-fitting suit, and I think a Hawaiian shirt, trudged up 3 stairs to the small stage and sat down. He looked tired, ruddy, and needed a haircut. A treacly version of Amazing Grace began to play. No matter how bad the version, and this one was artless and goopy, when played at the right moment, that song will get to you. I sniffled and wiped tears from my eyes. I didn't think I would be much of a public mourner, but I was wrong. The pastor creaked upward as the song ended and started out his service with a reading of Psalms 23, that old chestnut. He read through it 3 times. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. When he announced that he was related to Darrel, I felt slightly relieved. All right, good. Perhaps he could enlighten us on Darrel's passing, make us feel better about it, put it into a context. He mentioned many times that he had been a pastor for 41 years, so surely he was good at this by now. But this guy was terrible in ways that I am still unpacking. He knew nothing about Darrel. He hadn't seen him in many years. He might have been drunk. Something was off. He got the date of his death wrong, saying, he must have liked 14 because he was born on January 14th and died on May 14th. The aunt corrected him. Oh, May 4th. That's right. The pastor then stumbled through reading the rough outline of our friend's life written in the program. It hit all the high notes: saxophone, music, and he left behind a cat. Perfect. That's certainly how I would like to be remembered. She played the flute 100 years ago, really loved the vocal trio Wilson Phillips, and we think the mammal she fed will probably notice she's gone. I can't capture all of the ways this addled Baytown preacher's hour-long ramble was terrible. There was a detour about how the church used to be a barbecue restaurant. And then he remembered some other family member who died long before Darrell was even born and started crying about that guy because he was such a great guy. But here was the worst of it. He read one of Darrell's Facebook posts from 2012, apparently given to him by Darrell's mother, regarding his doubts about religious faith and lack of understanding of football. I went back and found it. Here's what it said. 2 things I've always envied in others. 1, the joy and peace that accompanies the faith that God loves and watches over you, or at least, exists. And 2, liking sports of any kind, but especially football. Religion is an absolute lost cause, but I'm still open to football. I just don't get it. The pastor read a manipulative section of these words. He never said the absolute lost cause part, and leaned on his cross podium, looked out over his glasses at all of us bewildered people, so close to rushing the stage and taking away his microphone, and said, "Well, Darrell, I'm going to explain football to you." After some incoherent minutes of bullshit about how he's connected to a UT coach and how everyone he knows loves football, how, of course, everyone at the funeral also loved football, he finished by saying in dramatic preacher fashion that his son's football coach once said, "Football is about kicking rear end." The pastor returned behind his cross and mumbled, "Football is about kicking rear end and toughening up." You don't know Darrell, but you might know someone like him. Someone you have tried to help but can't, who disappears for long stretches of time, who has lost ties to a fulfilling life, who holds on to people like life preservers until they have to leave the burden behind and save themselves. He was fragile. He needed help. It felt like the pastor was kicking a dead man. Darrell just needed to toughen up, and then he wouldn't be dead right now. Then, for the final insult, the pastor came back to Darrell's few words about faith. It's clear from the post that Darrell struggled with God, but that flew over the pastor's head. All he saw was great hope that Darrell believed that joy and peace were possible through God. He used this to drill into us that we could all be saved. It was a teachable moment. I felt so sad then. Darrell might have overdosed, might have committed suicide. He had nothing to live for. His family could not admit to that. The only thing they could do was blind themselves with the bright colors of religion and empty hope and non-specific joy that had no real meaning in their lives. They didn't even play the right songs. His friends had given the family songs to play. We know this is what he wants played at his funeral. Didn't happen. We stuck around for a few minutes after the service was over. The family drank soda and ate sandwiches while the rest of us whispered to each other, shocked, What just happened? I wanted to run or vomit. There isn't much of an ending to this story, unless you count the 5 hours a group of us spent at Big Star getting drunk and hashing it out. The bartenders were very kind to us. One whispered to me, "I'm sorry about your friend," as she picked up an empty by my arm. It was kind. When Darrell asked for my help in 2015, I asked him what he needed. He responded, "Give me a little time to put my thoughts together. I find it harder and harder to concentrate these days, which is something I hate most of all. I used to be a smart, funny, curious, articulate person. I'm fighting so hard to get that guy back." But it just didn't happen. Thank you.